The guard's silent vigil. It was a blistering summer afternoon at the Buckingham Palace grounds, the kind that made the air feel like a thick, suffocating blanket. Tourists thronged behind the iron rock gates, their faces gleaming with excitement and anticipation, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ceremonial traditions that marked this grand place. Each one hoped for a moment of royal spectacle, a sliver of history they could carry home with them. Sergeant Darren Kingsley, a seasoned member of the Royal Guard, stood poised at his post by the east gate. His face was set in a stoic mask, each muscle trained to remain still, even as beads of sweat trickled down his temples and into the collar of his uniform. Tall, with deep brown skin that contrasted sharply with his bright red jacket, Darren was an imposing figure. He had earned his post here through years of rigorous discipline and an unwavering sense of duty, standing as a symbol of the country's legacy and pride. Yet, today felt different. There was a tension in the air, one that seemed to settle uneasily around him, making him more aware than usual of the stares that lingered on his figure. It had been 6 years since Darren first donned the Royal Guard's iconic attire, 6 years of carrying the weight of tradition and honor on his shoulders. He had grown accustomed to the murmurs, the excited whispers, and the occasional sleet insult muttered too low for most to hear. It was part of the job, part of being a Royal Guard. Unmovable, unshaken, the epitome of restraint. Darren held his ground, not because it was easy, but because he saw this position as something bigger than himself. Each day, he reminded himself he was part of a centuries-old legacy, a standing testament to discipline and dedication. As the changing of the guard ceremony commenced, Darren remained motionless, staring straight ahead, his gaze locked on a distant point across the grounds. The band's music swelled, its cadence familiar, almost comforting. Tourists pressed closer, phones held aloft, capturing every moment of the procession, each movement choreographed and perfected through countless rehearsals. Among the throng of visitors, one voice sliced through the crowd. Sharp, mocking, and carrying a hint of disdain, it was unmistakable. Darren didn't look, didn't flinch, but the voice had his full attention. "Hey, you, the one in red, why don't you crack a smile for us?" The taunt came from a tall woman, her blonde hair tied back in a tight ponytail. She stood with a smug expression, her phone poised in front of her, recording as she smirked. The crowd murmured, some looking away uncomfortably, others chuckling nervously. Darren ignored her, his face a practiced mask of indifference. Over the years, he had endured countless remarks, some curious, others outright disrespectful, but he never reacted. He'd been trained to be a statue, after all. But this woman was different. She pressed on, clearly intent on provoking him. "Standing there all stiff, aren't you? You probably don't even understand English." She sneered, her voice louder, her words slithering through the crowd, each one laced with venom. Darren felt a surge of heat rise from his chest, not from the blazing sun above, but from something deeper, something primal that he had long trained himself to bury. He clung to his training, anchoring himself in his breathing, keeping his eyes fixed ahead, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a response. The woman's tone grew mocking, and as she continued, more bystanders gathered, their laughter emboldening her. Her voice shifted from ridicule to open contempt. She glanced at the young boy by her side, likely her nephew, and whispered something in his ear. The boy giggled, and without warning, he reached into his pocket and tossed a small rock in Darren's direction. The pebble struck Darren's boot, a light impact that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But to Darren, it felt like a line being crossed. A tiny object, insignificant in weight, yet carrying the full force of years of suppressed anger, pain, and exhaustion. The child grinned up at his aunt, proud of his act, while she laughed, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Darren's jaw clenched imperceptibly, his fists tightening against his rifle. He was not just a man in uniform. He was a human, one who had seen his share of struggles, who had fought through more than the woman could ever imagine. Behind him, another guard, Corporal Isaac Matthews shifted, catching Darren's eye. They shared a brief, silent understanding. Isaac had been his closest comrade for years, and he knew the toll that comments like these could take. Isaac gave a slight nod, his eyes encouraging Darren to hold firm. But Darren's patience was wearing thin. The woman, now emboldened by the lack of response from any authorities, stepped closer, her sneer deepening. "Maybe if you were a real Brit, you'd understand," she spat, her words cutting through Darren's calm like a knife. At that moment, a security officer noticed the commotion and approached her, his stance firm and authoritative. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low but commanding, "I need you to step back and show respect to the guard. This is not a place for mockery or harassment." The woman scowled, reluctant to back down, but the officer's presence seemed to quell her for the moment. She retreated a step, her expression one of bitter resentment, yet still her eyes held a mocking gleam. As she moved back into the crowd, Darren released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He kept his posture, kept his gaze forward, but inside, he was seething. He felt the weight of his duty pressing down on him like never before, his commitment to the uniform clashing with his anger, his desire to be seen not just as a symbol, but as a person worthy of respect. Unbeknownst to him, the woman had not given up. She had only stepped back to plot her next move. And as the ceremony continued, Darren could sense the tension building around him, a silent storm ready to erupt. That day would be one he would never forget. A day when loyalty, restraint, and the weight of tradition would collide with something raw and powerful within him, testing the very core of who he was. The brewing storm. As the crowd dispersed momentarily, Darren breathed a quiet sigh, trying to center himself. But his respite was brief. The mocking woman had not fully backed down. Instead, she lingered on the sidelines, her eyes narrowed with a calculating look, her fingers tapping impatiently on her phone. The tourists around her began to lose interest, drawn back into the allure of the changing of the guard, their cameras focused on the formal spectacle. But the woman's gaze remained firmly on Darren, as if she saw him less as a person and more as a challenge. Darren steeled himself, replaying his years of training in his mind like a mantra. But today felt different. The routine lines he recited to himself, "Stay composed, stand tall, keep silent," felt hollow. He'd spent years enduring the occasional jeer, the disrespect, the assumption that, as a Black Royal Guard, he was somehow out of place in this historic setting. But he had always prided himself on his resilience, on the strength he brought to the uniform. And yet, a seed of doubt had been planted. The woman's taunts had struck a nerve, challenging not only his position as a guard, but his very presence in this role. It was as though she were saying he didn't belong, that he was merely an outsider dressed up to play a part that wasn't his. The thought gnawed at him, and he felt the tension in his muscles, the urge to defend himself, to assert his place here. As the ceremony continued, Darren kept his gaze forward, unblinking, his posture rigid. The crowd was larger now, a mosaic of faces and flashes from phones and cameras. His gaze drifted to a young black boy standing beside his mother near the front. The child looked up at him with wide eyes, a mixture of admiration and awe. Darren recognized that look. He'd seen it before on the faces of children from his neighborhood who marveled at his position, inspired by the sight of someone who looked like them standing among the royal guards. It was for them, he reminded himself, that he kept his composure, that he endured the taunts. He knew that his presence here meant something, that it showed young people of color that they too had a place in the traditions and symbols of this country. But as he watched the boy's face light up, he also saw the woman standing nearby, watching with a cruel gleam in her eye. Darren felt a flicker of anger, a smoldering flame that had been kept under tight control for years. He thought about all the sacrifices he had made for this role, the countless hours of training, the moments when he had swallowed his pride to maintain his duty. His mind flashed back to a memory, one that had kept him grounded through the years. It was his mother, standing at the edge of a small field where he trained as a teenager, a proud but weary smile on her face. She had worked long hours cleaning offices to support him and his siblings, her hands often red and chapped, her body worn from labor. When he told her he wanted to join the Royal Guard, she hadn't questioned it, even though she knew the challenges he would face. "You're strong, Darren," she told him, her voice both a comfort and a warning. "But you're going to need that strength more than ever." Those words echoed in his mind as he stood before the mocking woman, who was still watching him, her sneer deepening as she noticed the young boy looking up at Darren with admiration. She leaned down to whisper something to the child's mother, her voice too low for Darren to hear, but enough to make the woman pull her son closer, glancing uncomfortably at Darren. Darren's jaw tightened, his heart pounding against his ribs. The woman straightened, catching Darren's eye with a smirk that dared him to react, to break the stoic exterior that he had trained so hard to maintain. Suddenly, she leaned over the rail, her voice cutting through the noise. "You're just a statue, aren't you? Just standing there, doing nothing. Is that all you can do?" She looked to the boy's mother again, her voice dripping with condescension. "Look at him, pretending he belongs here. They're just putting him out here for show, you know. It's all for the cameras." The young boy's eyes filled with confusion as he looked from Darren to the woman, absorbing her words with a mixture of disappointment and hurt. Darren felt a surge of protectiveness for the boy, a desire to show him that these words were meaningless, that his role here meant something deeper. But just as he was about to look away, the woman reached into her purse, her expression turning to a calculated smile. She took out her phone and began recording, speaking loudly enough for those around her to hear. "Let's see if this so-called guard can even do his job right. Come on, smile for the camera. Or are you too good for that?" Darren's face remained impassive, but inside, a storm was raging. He was being put on display, reduced to a caricature, stripped of the dignity he had fought so hard to maintain. He knew that he was supposed to ignore her, to pretend her words meant nothing. But the smirk on her face, the cruel glint in her eyes, made it nearly impossible. As he stood there, another guard approached, sensing the tension and moving closer as if to intervene. Darren recognized him. It was Corporal Isaac Matthews. Isaac gave Darren a subtle nod, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this. They had trained together, endured the same grueling hours, and Isaac knew better than anyone what Darren was going through. But just as Isaac stepped forward, the woman's taunts escalated. She pointed her phone directly at Darren, her voice louder, more mocking. "Come on, show us something. Aren't you going to defend yourself, or are you just going to stand there like a statue? I bet you wouldn't even flinch if someone slapped you." The words hung in the air, daring him, challenging him in a way that felt more personal than any insult he'd endured before. It was as though she was chipping away at his very identity, reducing him to a passive figure, a symbol without substance. Darren clenched his fists, his pulse racing, his breathing shallow. And then she stepped closer, crossing the invisible line between taunt and threat. She reached over the fence, her hand hovering inches from his face, her eyes locked onto his with a malicious glint. "What, are you scared?" she sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "Can't even defend yourself, can you?" Darren's grip tightened around his rifle, his knuckles turning white beneath his gloves. He could feel every muscle in his body tensing, the urge to react overwhelming. But in the back of his mind, he heard his mother's voice, her words of warning. This was what she had prepared him for, the moments when he would be tested not by physical trials but by the unseen weights of prejudice and provocation. The crowd was watching now, their faces a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Some looked away, unwilling to witness the unfolding scene, while others watched with a perverse sense of curiosity, wondering if the guard would finally break. Darren's chest rose and fell with steady breaths as he forced himself to focus on his training, on the silent discipline that had become second nature to him. He would not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. He would not let her rob him of the pride he held in his role, the pride he had earned through years of dedication. But then, with a sudden movement, the woman's hand lashed out, her fingers brushing against his cheek in a light slap that was more symbolic than forceful. It was a deliberate, calculated act, designed to humiliate, to provoke. And it worked. Darren's eyes flickered, a spark of something fierce and unyielding breaking through his calm exterior. His fists unclenched, his hand moving instinctively to his cheek where her fingers had made contact. The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock passing through the bystanders as they realized what had just happened. Isaac stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Ma'am, you need to step back. This is unacceptable." But the woman only laughed, her smile widening as she watched Darren's reaction. "Oh, look at him," she sneered. "Finally showing a bit of life, are we?" Darren looked down, fighting to regain control, to push the anger back down. But something had changed. The slap, as light as it had been, felt like a crack in his resolve, a breach in the armor he had so carefully built. He had always prided himself on his restraint, his ability to endure, but today, something inside him had shifted. The crowd was murmuring, their expressions ranging from shock to sympathy to outright disdain. Darren could feel their eyes on him, judging, expecting. And in that moment, he realized that his choice would not only define his own path, but would shape how others saw him, how the young boy in the crowd would remember him. Taking the deep breath, Darren looked up, his gaze steady, his expression resolute. He would not give her the satisfaction of a reaction, but he would not remain silent either. Slowly, he straightened, his posture regaining the dignity that had momentarily slipped. His voice, calm and steady, cut through the crowd, directed at the woman, but meant for everyone to hear. "Respect," he said, his words simple but carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs around him. "This uniform stands for respect, for everyone here, including you." The woman faltered, her smirk slipping as the crowd turned their attention to her, their expressions shifting from curiosity to condemnation. Darren held her gaze, unyielding, his words a quiet reminder that no amount of taunting could strip him of the pride he held in his role. As he stood there, the weight of the moment settling around him, he knew that this was only the beginning. The storm was far from over, but he was ready to face it, with the strength and resilience that had carried him this far. Breaking the silence. As Darren's words echoed through the crowd, a hush fell over the courtyard. Tourists shifted uncomfortably, many avoiding the woman's gaze, while others looked to Darren with newfound respect. He held his position, his posture as straight and unwavering as ever, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, a sense of strength and quiet pride that silenced even the most curious onlookers. He had spoken not to defend himself, but to reclaim his dignity, to remind those around him that he stood for something far greater than himself. The woman's face flushed, her arrogance faltering as the weight of the crowd's judgment pressed down on her. She glanced around, clearly uncomfortable under the piercing gazes of those who had witnessed her taunts, her bravado unraveling in the face of their silent condemnation. "You're all just soft," she muttered under her breath, though her voice carried a trace of uncertainty. Her nephew tugged at her sleeve, his earlier amusement replaced with a look of confusion and discomfort. Even he could sense the shift in the atmosphere, the quiet, collective disapproval directed at his aunt. The young black boy who had been watching Darren throughout the ceremony looked up at him with wide, admiring eyes, his small face reflecting a mix of awe and pride. Darren caught his gaze and offered a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement of the connection they shared. It was a reminder of why he did what he did, why he endured. He wasn't just a royal guard. He was a symbol, and today he would hold on to that role no matter the cost. But the peace didn't last. Just as the crowd began to disperse, an official-looking figure emerged from the palace's side gate, striding purposefully toward Darren. It was Captain Alan Stokes, a senior officer who oversaw the guard's conduct and performance. Darren had seen him only a handful of times, usually during inspections or ceremonial reviews, but he knew Stokes by reputation. firm, no nonsense, and unyielding when it came to protocol. Captain Stokes's expression was inscrutable as he approached, but there was a tension in his stride, a tightness around his mouth that suggested he was not pleased. Darren braced himself, preparing for whatever reprimand might come. He had spoken out of turn, broken the silence expected of him, and while his intentions were clear in his heart, he knew that wouldn't matter to someone like Stokes. "Sergeant Kingsley," Stokes began, his voice low but firm. "A word, if you please." The crowd watched as Stokes led Darren to a more private spot, away from prying eyes, but close enough for whispers to carry. Darren followed, his face impassive, though he felt a knot of anxiety forming in his chest. Stokes turned to face him, arms crossed, his gaze steely. "Do you understand the position you're in, Sergeant?" he asked, his tone clipped. "Yes, sir," Darren replied, keeping his voice steady. "Do you also understand that by speaking, you violated protocol?" Stokes continued, his eyes narrowing. "Your duty is to remain silent, no matter the circumstances. This isn't the place for personal statements." Darren took a steadying breath, choosing his words carefully. "Sir, I understand that. But I wasn't speaking out of personal interest. I spoke to remind that woman, and everyone else, of the respect this position deserves." Captain Stokes's expression didn't soften. "Respect is earned by adherence to protocol, not by breaking it," he replied coolly. "Your actions have drawn attention, Sergeant, and not the kind we want. The Royal Guard is a symbol of discipline, of restraint. By speaking, you've undermined that image." Darren clenched his fists behind his back, frustration simmering beneath the surface. He wanted to explain, to defend his choice, but he knew it would be pointless. Stokes wasn't interested in understanding his motives. He was interested in maintaining order, in preserving the image of the guards as unyielding and unresponsive. "Sir, if I may," Darren began, his voice calm but resolute, "I believe that silence in the face of disrespect only encourages it. I wasn't just standing there as a guard. I was standing there as a human being, representing the values of this institution." I couldn't let her words go unanswered. Stokes's jaw tightened, and for a moment there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not sympathy, exactly, but perhaps a hint of understanding. Yet he quickly hardened his expression, returning to his stern, unyielding demeanor. "That may be true in your mind, Sergeant," he said, his voice steely. "But here, your duty is to the Crown, to the image we uphold. Anything that disrupts that image, no matter the justification, is unacceptable." Darren felt the weight of Stokes's words pressing down on him, a heavy reminder of the sacrifices he had made to be here. He had always believed that this role was about more than silent obedience, that it was about embodying a sense of dignity and honor. But today, he was being told that even that belief was secondary to the image he was expected to maintain. Stokes straightened, his tone turning formal. "As a result of your actions today, Sergeant Kingsley, I am issuing a formal reprimand. You are relieved from duty for the remainder of the day. Report to the barracks immediately." Darren's heart sank, though he kept his face impassive. A reprimand was a serious consequence, one that would remain on his record, potentially affecting his future with the Royal Guard. Yet he nodded, accepting the decision with quiet dignity. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice steady. Stokes turned, leaving Darren standing alone, his heart heavy with a mixture of disappointment and frustration. He had acted on instinct, on a sense of integrity that he had thought aligned with his role. But today had shown him that the institution he served valued silence over integrity, obedience over humanity. As he made his way toward the barracks, the crowd parted around him, some casting sympathetic glances, others watching with a morbid curiosity. He kept his head held high, refusing to let the shame of the reprimand weigh him down. But inside, he felt the sting of betrayal, a sense that his dedication had been dismissed, his sacrifice disregarded. Once he reached the barracks, Darren removed his uniform with a heaviness that felt unfamiliar. The bright red jacket, The polished black boots, the ornate hat, they were symbols he had worn with pride, symbols that now felt like a hollow shell. He changed into his civilian clothes, folding the uniform carefully, almost reverently, and placing it on his bunk. As he stood there, he felt a surge of doubt, a questioning of the very path he had chosen. Had he been wrong to believe in the values he thought the Royal Guard represented? Was his presence here merely a performance, a token gesture without real meaning? The door to the barracks creaked open, and Darren looked up to see Corporal Isaac Matthews standing in the doorway. Isaac had a somber look on his face, his usual easy smile replaced by an expression of quiet concern. He walked over, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent room. "Darren," he said softly, his tone gentle. "I heard what happened. Are you all right?" Darren forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Isaac. Just another day in the life of a Royal Guard, right?" Isaac gave him a searching look, seen through the forced bravado. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said quietly. "I know it's not easy. I know you've dealt with more than your fair share." Darren felt a lump form in his throat, the words he had held back threatening to spill out. But he swallowed them, unwilling to burden Isaac with his frustration. Instead, he nodded, his gaze fixed on the uniform lying neatly on his bunk. "I just thought it meant something," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought this role was about more than just standing there, about more than just silence." Isaac placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. "It does mean something, Darren," he said firmly. "Maybe not to everyone, but to people like that young boy in the crowd today. To the ones who look up to you. It means everything." Darren looked up, meeting Isaac's gaze, his heart heavy but filled with a glimmer of hope. Isaac was right. Despite the reprimand, despite the judgment of those who didn't understand, his role did have meaning. He had shown that boy, and everyone else watching, that respect, dignity, and integrity mattered, even in the face of prejudice. But as he sat there, the weight of the day still pressing down on him, Darren knew that he couldn't continue in this role if it meant sacrificing his sense of self. He had a decision to make, one that would not only affect his career but his very identity. And as he looked at the uniform folded neatly on his bunk, he realized that his choice would define the path he would take from here. Whether he continued as a silent symbol or forged his own way, he knew one thing for certain. He would no longer remain silent in the face of injustice, no matter the cost. A path forward. The barracks were eerily quiet as Darren sat alone, the weight of the day pressing down on him with an almost physical force. Outside, the usual cadence of boots against stone echoed faintly, a reminder of the life he had known for years, a life built on discipline, loyalty, and silence. But today, for the first time, he questioned whether those values had ever truly belonged to him, or if he had simply adopted them to fit into a role he had been taught to revere. His uniform lay folded neatly on his bunk, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded earlier. It was hard to believe that only hours ago he had stood at the East Gate, a symbol of stability and tradition. Now that same uniform felt foreign, as if it belonged to someone else, someone who could stand silently in the face of humiliation and walk away unscathed. Darren's thoughts churned, a storm of conflicting emotions swirling within him. Part of him wanted to forget the entire incident, to return to his role, and prove to Stokes and everyone else that he was capable of maintaining the stoic facade they demanded. But another part of him, the part that had always yearned for something deeper, something real, couldn't let go of the woman's taunts, the slap that had shattered his composure, and most of all, the reprimand that had cast him aside like a cog in a machine. As he sat in silence, the door creaked open, and he looked up to see Isaac standing in the doorway once more, his expression serious. He held a manila envelope in his hand, its edges worn as though it had been carried around for some time. Darren raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued, but he said nothing as Isaac approached. "Darren," Isaac began, his voice low, "I thought you should have this." He held out the envelope, his gaze steady. It's something I've been holding onto for a while. Thought it might be useful one day. Darren hesitated, then took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the worn paper. He opened it carefully, revealing a letter and a small pamphlet titled The Hidden Stories of the Palace Guards. Intrigued, he unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the neat handwriting. It was from a former guard, someone who had served before Darren's time. The letter spoke of the challenges he had faced as one of the few minority guards in the regiment, the silent battles he had fought against prejudice, and the loneliness that had come with standing out in an institution that prized uniformity above all else. The words resonated with Darren, each line a mirror to his own experience, a reminder that he was not the first, and likely not the last, to feel out of place in a role steeped in tradition. The pamphlet, too, told a story he had never known. It was a collection of anecdotes from guards who had left the regiment, stories that had been quietly erased from the official record. There were tales of guards who had spoken out against injustice, who had refused to remain silent in the face of prejudice, and who had, in doing so, paid a steep price. Yet there was a sense of pride in those stories, a quiet defiance that spoke to Darren's own struggles. Isaac watched him read, his gaze thoughtful. "I found that years ago," he said quietly. "I don't know who wrote it, but it made me realize that we're not alone in this. There have always been people like us, people who don't quite fit the mold but who find a way to make it work." Darren looked up, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Why are you giving this to me now?" Isaac sighed, his expression softening. "Because I know you, Darren. I know you're questioning everything right now. And I wanted you to see that there's more to this role than just standing silently. You have a choice. You can walk away, find something that feels true to who you are, or you can stay and make a change from within." Darren considered Isaac's words, his gaze drifting back to the pamphlet. The stories it contained were raw, unfiltered, the voices of people who had dared to defy the institution's unspoken rules. It was a reminder that even in a place as rigid as the Royal Guard, there were those who had found a way to carve out their own identity. After a moment, Darren spoke, his voice steady but contemplative. "I thought being a guard was about embodying tradition, about honoring something bigger than myself. But now I'm starting to wonder if it's worth it. If I'm worth it." Isaac's expression turned serious. "Darren, don't let one person's ignorance make you question your worth. You're here because you earned it, because you have something to offer that no one else does. Don't let them take that from you." Darren nodded, his heart heavy but filled with a sense of resolve. For so long, he had allowed himself to be shaped by the expectations of others, to be molded into a role that often felt like a cage. But today, he had glimpsed something else, a way to honor the values he held dear without sacrificing his identity. As he sat in silence, a knock echoed through the barracks, and the door swung open to reveal Captain Stokes once more. His expression was unreadable, a hint of tension in his posture as he glanced between Darren and Isaac. "Sergeant Kingsley," he began, his tone formal, "you're to report to the administrative office immediately. There's someone who wishes to speak with you." Darren exchanged a glance with Isaac, his curiosity piqued, though he couldn't shake the sense of unease that settled over him. He stood, following Stokes out of the barracks and through the quiet corridors of the palace, his mind racing with questions. As they reached the administrative office, Darren's eyes fell upon a figure seated at the desk, her posture composed, but her expression one of quiet determination. She was an older woman, dressed in a sleek, tailored suit that spoke of authority and elegance. Her gaze was sharp, assessing, as she looked up to meet Darren's eyes. "Sergeant Kingsley," she greeted, her voice cool but not unkind. "My name is Lady Eleanor Whitmore. I represent the palace's public relations department." Darren inclined his head, uncertain of why he had been summoned, but prepared to face whatever consequences awaited him. Lady Whitmore studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing, before she spoke. "I understand there was an incident today," she began, her tone measured. "An altercation with a tourist that has, garnered some attention. Darren swallowed, nodding. "Yes, Mom. I take full responsibility for my actions." Lady Whitmore raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering in her eyes. "I don't believe you understand, Sergeant. This isn't a reprimand. In fact, I'm here to commend you." Darren blinked, taken aback. He glanced at Stokes, whose expression remained neutral, though there was a glint of surprise in his eyes. "Commend me," Darren repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. Lady Whitmore nodded. "The palace has received a flood of messages from visitors who witnessed the incident. They were impressed by your restraint, by the dignity with which you handled yourself in the face of provocation. In fact, they believe that your actions today have highlighted an issue that we, as an institution, must address." Darren stared at her, struggling to process her words. He had expected punishment, dismissal, perhaps even public humiliation. But this was something he had never anticipated. Lady Whitmore leaned forward, her gaze steady. "Sergeant Kingsley, your actions today have brought attention to the fact that the Royal Guard is not merely a symbol of tradition, but a representation of the people we serve. Your presence here is a reminder that our history is diverse, that our values are rooted in respect and inclusivity. And I believe that is something worth celebrating." Darren felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief and pride that he struggled to contain. He had spent years feeling like an outsider, like a token figure in an institution that valued silence over humanity. But today, he had proven, to himself and to those who had watched, that he was more than just a figure in a uniform. Lady Whitmore continued, her expression thoughtful. "However, there is still the matter of your future here. You have a choice to make, Sergeant. You can continue as you are, remaining silent and upholding tradition. Or you can embrace this opportunity to bring change from within, to use your position to inspire others, to show them that the Royal Guard is not merely a relic of the past, but a beacon of progress." Darren felt his heart pounding in his chest, a sense of purpose igniting within him. He glanced at Stokes, who gave him a subtle nod of approval, and then back at Lady Whitmore. "I'd like to stay," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "But I want to do more than just stand silently. I want to be a part of something meaningful, to show others that respect and dignity are not just words but values we live by." Lady Whitmore smiled, a genuine warmth in her gaze. "Then, Sergeant Kingsley, welcome to the new face of the Royal Guard." As Darren left the office, a sense of clarity washed over him, a feeling that he was finally on the path he had always been meant to walk. He was no longer merely a guard. He was a symbol of resilience, of progress, and of hope. And as he returned to the palace grounds, he knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would test him in ways he had never imagined. But he was ready, armed with the knowledge that his role meant something far greater than tradition. It was a legacy, one that he would shape with courage, integrity, and an unwavering belief in the power of change. A test of conviction. The next morning, Darren stepped onto the palace grounds with a renewed sense of purpose, his uniform fitting differently, almost as if it had taken on a new significance. He stood taller, his gaze steady, his heart filled with a quiet confidence that came not just from duty, but from a sense of identity, an understanding that his role meant something more than silent obedience. The events of the previous day had left a profound mark on him, reshaping his view of what it meant to be a Royal Guard. He wasn't just a figure in a uniform. He was a testament to resilience, a bridge between tradition and progress. Yet, as he stood at attention for the morning briefing, he noticed the way his colleagues glanced at him, some with curiosity, others with something more guarded worry. They had all heard about the confrontation, the reprimand, and the surprising commendation that followed. Darren could feel the unspoken questions in their eyes. Would he still be the same? Or had yesterday's events changed him in ways they couldn't yet understand? Captain Stokes led the briefing with his usual air of authority, his voice calm and measured as he outlined the day's duties. But as he spoke, his gaze flickered to Darren, a hint of tension in his expression. Darren knew that while Lady Whitmore's commendation had shifted the official stance on his actions, there were those within the ranks who saw his defiance as a threat to the strict discipline and order they valued. Change, especially within an institution as steeped in tradition as the Royal Guard, was rarely met without resistance. Once the briefing ended, Stokes approached Darren, his demeanor neutral but his eyes sharp. "Sergeant Kingsley, a word." Darren nodded, following him down a corridor that led to a quieter part of the palace grounds. Stokes's pace was brisk, his posture tense, and Darren prepared himself for whatever conversation awaited him. When they reached a secluded alcove, Stokes turned, his expression unreadable. "I understand that Lady Whitmore had seen fit to commend you for your actions yesterday," he began, his tone clipped. "Yes, sir," Darren replied, keeping his voice steady. Stokes's jaw tightened slightly. "I want to make something clear, Sergeant. While you may have received support from certain members of the palace administration, I expect you to adhere to the standards of conduct that have been upheld for centuries. The Royal Guard is a symbol, not a platform for individual expression." Darren met Stokes's gaze, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. "With all due respect, sir, I believe that my actions yesterday were in line with the values this role is meant to represent. Respect, dignity, and integrity are part of what it means to serve." Stokes's expression hardened. "You're walking a fine line, Kingsley. The Royal Guard does not bend to individual interpretation. You may have Lady Whitmore's favor now, but favor is fleeting. Step out of line again, and I assure you, the consequences will be far more severe." Darren swallowed, resisting the urge to respond with the frustration simmering inside him. He knew that challenging Stokes would only deepen the divide, and while he was prepared to defend his stance, he also understood the delicate balance he needed to maintain. "Yes, sir," he said finally, his voice measured. "I understand." Stokes gave him a curt nod, his expression unyielding, before turning on his heel and striding away. Darren watched him go, a sense of conflict churning within him. He had expected resistance, but Stokes's words felt like a warning, a reminder that his position was precarious. As he made his way back to his post, Darren's mind raced. He had taken this path to bring meaning to his role, to inspire those who looked up to him, but he hadn't anticipated the tension it would bring. He realized now that he was not just fighting against the attitudes of the public, but also against the deeply ingrained beliefs within the institution itself. Over the next few days, Darren noticed subtle changes in how his colleagues interacted with him. Some, like Isaac, were openly supportive, treating him with a respect that went beyond mere camaraderie. But others kept their distance, their expressions guarded, as though unsure whether to view him as a fellow guard or as an outsider disrupting their ranks. One afternoon, as he stood at his post near the East Gate, a group of young recruits passed by, their voices low but filled with an unmistakable curiosity. Darren caught snippets of their conversation, the words troublemaker and attention seeker whispered among them. He kept his gaze forward, his expression impassive, but their words stung, a reminder of the divide that had begun to form between him and those who had once been his brothers in arms. But it wasn't all whispers and sideways glances. There were those who approached him with genuine interest, eager to understand the person behind the uniform. One of them was Corporal Jane Phillips, a guard known for her dedication and unflinching professionalism. She was respected among her peers, her loyalty to the regiment unwavering. But today, as she approached Darren during a break, there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes, a hint of something softer. "Sergeant Kingsley," she began, her tone respectful but inquisitive, "I've heard a lot about what happened the other day. I wanted to hear it from you, though. Why did you speak up?" Darren looked at her, surprised by her directness, but grateful for the chance to explain himself. "I spoke up because I felt that silence wasn't enough. That woman was disrespecting everything this uniform stands for, and I couldn't let her words go unanswered. It wasn't about me. It was about what we represent." Phillips nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I can see that, But you know as well as I do that our duty is to stand still, to remain silent. Some might say that you overstepped." Darren met her gaze, his expression resolute. "Maybe I did, but I believe that respect and integrity are part of our duty too. If we let people treat us as props, then we're not just compromising ourselves, we're compromising what we stand for." Phillips considered his words, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "You know, not everyone would have the courage to do what you did. It's risky, challenging the way things have always been." Darren smiled, a flicker of gratitude warming his heart. "Sometimes, the risk is worth it. Change doesn't come without a price." Phillips nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. She gave him a slight nod of respect before walking away, leaving Darren with a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that while there were those who resisted his approach, there were also others who were open to the possibility of change, who understood the importance of evolving in the face of a changing world. As the days passed, Darren's new role began to take shape. Lady Whitmore had arranged for him to work with the palace's outreach program, visiting schools and community centers, sharing his story with young people who had never seen themselves represented in roles of authority. He spoke to them not just as a guard, but as a person who had faced adversity, who had learned to stand tall in the face of prejudice. At first, he had felt uncertain, out of place in these settings. He was used to the silence and stillness of guard duty, not the lively chatter of young students and community members. But as he shared his experiences, as he saw the way their eyes lit up with recognition and pride, he realized that this was where his true purpose lay. One evening, after a long day of visits, Darren returned to the palace to find a small envelope waiting for him on his bunk. Inside was a letter, written in neat, familiar handwriting. It was from Isaac. "Darren, I just wanted to let you know how proud I am of you. Not everyone understands what you're doing, but I do. You're not just a guard. You're a leader. Keep going, no matter what they say. Isaac." Darren felt a surge of emotion, the quiet support of his friend filling him with strength. He knew that the path he had chosen would not be easy, that there would be days when the resistance he faced would feel overwhelming. But he also knew that he was not alone, that there were people who believed in him, who saw the value in what he was trying to achieve. In the weeks that followed, Darren's presence began to shift the atmosphere within the regiment. Some guards continued to view him with suspicion, their loyalty to tradition blinding them to the importance of progress. But others, inspired by his resilience, began to see their roles in a new light, embracing the idea that they were not just silent symbols, but living embodiments of values that transcended centuries. One day, as Darren stood at his post, he noticed the young boy who had watched him with such admiration during the fateful encounter weeks before. The boy's face lit up as he caught sight of Darren, and he waved enthusiastically, a wide grin spreading across his face. Darren smiled back, a feeling of warmth and pride filling his heart. He knew, in that moment, that this was why he had chosen this path, not for the approval of his superiors, not for the applause of the crowd, but for the quiet impact he could make on those who saw themselves in him. As he stood there, resolute and unyielding, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had found his purpose, his reason for standing guard, not just in silence, but in strength, and he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same dignity and integrity that had brought him here. For Darren Kingsley, the Royal Guard was no longer just a duty. It was a calling, a legacy he would shape with every step, every breath, every quiet moment of resilience. And in that silence, he had found his voice. Legacy in silence. Several months had passed since Darren's unexpected journey from silence to purpose began. Every day brought new challenges, new eyes watching him with curiosity, admiration, or even resistance. Yet with each day, he felt the weight of the past giving way to something far more meaningful, a legacy rooted not just in tradition, but in resilience and integrity. The whispers and glances that had once haunted him gradually faded, replaced by a quiet respect that even the most traditional guards now felt compelled to honor. Darren hadn't intended to become a symbol within the regiment, but it was undeniable that his actions had inspired change, a ripple of awareness that began to shift the attitudes of those around him. One morning, he arrived at the palace for his routine post, feeling a heightened sense of anticipation in the air. It was a special day, not just for the royal guard, but for the country. For the first time in the palace's history, the guards would be hosting a commemorative ceremony, honoring the diverse backgrounds and contributions of those who had served the crown. Lady Whitmore, with her characteristic grace and intelligence, had orchestrated the event, ensuring that it would be an inclusive celebration of the Guard's rich, yet often hidden, history. As the sun rose over Buckingham Palace, casting a golden glow over the crowds gathering outside the gates, Darren took his place at the East Gate, his posture as steadfast as ever. The air buzzed with excitement, families and community members crowding the front lines to witness the ceremony. It was a significant day for Darren as well, marking his official promotion to the position of corporal, an acknowledgement of his dedication and his role as a bridge between tradition and progress. But today was about more than his promotion. It was about a promise fulfilled, a vision realized. He felt the weight of his new rank with pride, understanding that it was not just a symbol of his accomplishments, but a reminder of his responsibilities to those who looked up to him. As he stood guard, he noticed a familiar face in the crowd. The young black boy who had watched him with admiration that first day, now standing with his mother, his gaze bright and hopeful. Darren met his eyes, offering a subtle nod, and the boy grinned, his excitement barely contained. Darren felt a surge of warmth, a reminder of the impact he had made on those who had never seen themselves represented in such a role. The ceremony began with the arrival of the regimental band, their music filling the air with a powerful melody that resonated through the palace grounds. The guards stood in perfect formation, their uniforms gleaming, their posture unyielding. But today, the silence that usually accompanied their presence felt different. It was a silence filled with purpose, with pride, with the knowledge that they were no longer just statues, but symbols of something far greater. Lady Whitmore took the stage, her voice clear and resonant as she addressed the crowd. She spoke of the history of the Royal Guard, of the countless individuals who had served with loyalty and honor, and of the need to embrace change in a way that respected tradition without losing sight of the present. Her words rang out with conviction, touching on themes of inclusion and resilience that Darren had come to embody. And today, she continued, her gaze sweeping over the guards, we celebrate those who have dared to be both guards and guardians of change. We honor those who have worn this uniform with integrity, who have shown us that the strength of the Royal Guard lies not just in silence, but in the courage to stand up for what is right. The crowd erupted in applause, their enthusiasm filling the courtyard with a vibrant energy. Darren stood still, his heart pounding, his pride swelling as he felt the weight of her words settle over him. He hadn't sought recognition, but today he understood that his journey had been about more than himself. It had been about paving a path for others to walk with dignity and strength. As the ceremony reached its peak, Lady Whitmore announced the presentation of a new award, one created in Darren's honor. The Kingsley Medal for Integrity and Resilience would be awarded annually to a member of the Royal Guard who exemplified the values of courage, respect, and inclusion. The announcement took Darren by surprise, and he felt a surge of emotion, the impact of his journey coming full circle in a way he had never anticipated. He was called to the stage, where Lady Whitmore presented him with the first Kingsley Medal, her smile warm and genuine as she shook his hand. The crowd watched in reverent silence, their eyes filled with admiration and gratitude. Darren felt a tear slip down his cheek, though he made no move to wipe it away. Today, his emotions were not a weakness. They were a testament to the resilience that had carried him through every moment of doubt and struggle. As he returned to his post, medal gleaming on his chest, the young boy he had noticed earlier called out to him, his voice filled with excitement. Corporal Kingsley. "Thank you." Darren smiled, his gaze softening as he looked at the boy. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady, though his heart was filled with emotion. The ceremony continued, the crowd dispersing slowly as the guards resumed their positions, their silence now one of respect rather than detachment. Darren watched as people lingered near the gates, some wiping away tears, others smiling with a newfound sense of pride. For them, the Royal Guard was no longer a distant, unapproachable institution. It was a part of them, a reflection of the resilience and courage that defined the heart of the nation. In the days that followed, Darren's role within the regiment continued to evolve. He became a mentor to new recruits, guiding them not just in the physical demands of the role, but in the emotional resilience needed to wear the uniform with integrity. His influence spread quietly but steadily, a ripple effect that touched every aspect of the regiment's culture. And though there were still moments of resistance, voices that clung to the rigid expectations of the past, Darren met them with the same quiet strength that had defined his journey. He understood now that change was not about forcing others to see things his way, it was about showing them, through his actions, that respect and dignity were values that transcended tradition. One evening, as Darren prepared to leave the palace, he noticed Captain Stokes standing by the east gate, his posture uncharacteristically relaxed. Stokes nodded to him, his expression thoughtful. "Kingsley," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I wanted to say, you've done well. Better than I expected." Darren raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, sir. I know it hasn't been easy." Stokes hesitated, then nodded. "No, it hasn't. But you've shown me, and others, that maybe there's room for both tradition and progress." Darren felt a sense of satisfaction settle over him, a quiet acknowledgement that his efforts had not only reached those looking up to him, but had begun to shift the perspectives of those who had once resisted him. He nodded respectfully, a silent understanding passing between them. As he left the palace grounds that night, Darren felt a profound sense of peace. He had found his purpose, his reason for standing guard, not just as a figure in a uniform, but as a living embodiment of resilience. His journey had been difficult, filled with moments of doubt and hardship, but it had also been a journey of growth, of transformation, of becoming. And though his role within the Royal Guard would continue to evolve, he knew that his legacy would endure. He had shown that silence was not weakness, that stillness was not passivity, and that true strength lay in the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it meant challenging the very traditions he had sworn to uphold. In the years that followed, Darren's influence would be felt in every corner of the palace. Young recruits would learn of his story, his journey from silence to purpose, and they would wear their uniforms with a pride that went beyond tradition. They would carry his legacy forward, each one a part of the legacy he had built through courage and integrity. And as for Darren, he would continue to stand guard, his posture unyielding, his gaze steady, a quiet strength emanating from within. For he was not just a royal guard. He was a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope, and a testament to the power of change. In his silence, he had found his voice, and in that voice, he had found a legacy that would stand the test of time.